Welcome back to our second lecture on South Africa. Today we're going to be talking about the two conflicts that in many ways are going to define the end of colonial South Africa, and those are the Boer Wars. Probably wars that you are not familiar with, not wars that really get into the textbooks all that often, certainly not from an American perspective, not something we think about. But from a geography perspective, they're very important because they're going to define the eventual shape of South Africa. By the way, can I just tell you this? I encourage you to look up a historical atlas of South Africa in the 1980s. You will notice that the historical boundaries of South Africa are much larger than modern-day South Africa. So there's a lot going on there that you'll research during apartheid when you research that this week. But the two areas that were once called the Dutch republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State are part of modern-day South Africa. And so to understand the country and, in fact, the entire region, we do have to talk about the two wars that are kind of the defining moment of South African history in many ways. From a political and geographical point of view, they're very, very important. And they're going to involve a colorful cast of characters, including Cecil Rhodes, the leader of the British during the Second Boer War, or the British governor of the Cape Colony specifically. It's going to involve the Zulu and one of Shaka Zulu's descendants. It's going to involve the important South Africans such as Paul Kruger, and really it's an interesting series of events. And from a world history perspective, it's also important because it introduces a large number of innovations that, if only the British had paid attention to, might have led to a far less bloody World War I. In many ways, the Second Boer War is a preview of not only World War I, but even more disturbingly, World War II. And not to spoil the ending and what we'll talk about near the end of this lecture, but that involves concentration camps and programs to eliminate ethnic groups that you don't like. Okay, so that's pretty heavy, and we're going to try and keep this lecture in general not so heavy, even though it's about war, but just know that the Boer Wars actually do unfortunately herald a lot of things that are going to cause serious problems in the 20th century, and I think they're often forgotten about or not even known about by Americans, and I hopefully want to rectify that in this lecture. So let's go back to where we ended the last lecture just to give ourselves a refresher. Remember, in 1814, the British took permanent possession of the Dutch colony of the Cape Colony from the Dutch Republic. The English settlers moved in the coastal region, and the Dutch were pushed out. These Dutch had begun calling themselves the Boers, which means farmers, or the Trans-Boers, which means the moving farmers, okay? And many of these people move hundreds of miles, upwards of 500 miles with their entire families, and they settle in the central regions of southern Africa, in areas that they renamed the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. These two regions had effectively become nations with their own parliaments, head of states, militaries, and they had signed peace agreements with the British Empire in the 1850s, 1852 and 1854 respectively, and those peace agreements effectively guaranteed them sovereignty over their own territory. They weren't allowed to start wars without British permission, so in some ways they were governed by Britain. But as far as their own internal politics, how they interacted with each other, how they handled things in their colonies, they were completely independent. And I think of them really as nations that simply agreed not to start any wars, which I think is a fine position to have. We also need to understand that both of these places had recently discovered a resource that Great Britain, and really, if we're honest, almost any government on earth has a vested interest in. And that, number one, was gold, which, remember, gold was the backing of the entire world commodity market and the entire world currency market, so probably even more valuable then than it would be today. And the other major discovery was diamonds. And diamonds, of course, have always been popular. And, by the way, many people think, wow, a lot of wars have been fought over diamonds, despite the fact that they're just pretty looking rocks. But actually, the reason that diamonds are so popular isn't just because they're pretty looking rocks. That definitely has led to wars. Okay? It's kind of sad, but it's true. But diamonds actually also have industrial purposes. You're probably generally somewhere in your brain familiar with that hardness scale you probably learned in geology or earth science a couple years ago. And that hardness scale goes from 1 to 10, and you'll remember that number 10 is diamonds, number 1 is talcum, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in between. My dad loved that scale. I used to know an example of everything. Now I can only tell you probably 5 or 6 of those. But I do know diamond's number 10. What does this mean? This means that diamond is so hard that it effectively cuts through anything on the scales below. And that's really what the scale represents. So something of hardness 9, like a sapphire, will cut through something of hardness 8, like a piece of quartz. Diamond being 10 will cut through anything else, up to and including itself. Why does all that matter? Because diamonds are used in industrial processes. If you want to cut something that otherwise resists being cut, you might use a diamond tip saw. In fact, some of your dads might have diamond tip saw blades in their workshop right now. I know I have one down in my basement, and you might think, wow, that's got to be really expensive. It's really not. You can even get diamond sandpaper if you want to. It's a little bit more expensive than normal, but it's not particularly bad. So diamonds have more value than just pretty rocks. They're also an industrial thing needed for industrial processes. And of course, in the 1870s and 1880s, Britain, the United States, and Germany are rapidly industrializing. I mean, we've got oil and steel and rubber production going out our ears. We have massive factories, massive building programs going on. So anything that can contribute to the financial health of the world, like gold, or the industrial health of the world, like diamonds, is immediately valuable. And this puts these Dutch republics in a very precarious situation. On the positive side, these resources might allow them to have the funding they need to protect themselves and stay independent. Before, they were poor farmer states. Okay? If anybody with a modern European army came gunning for them, they were probably going to lose. But now they have gold and they have diamonds. They can sell those suckers and they can turn them into weapons. Okay? Sell the diamonds and the gold for cash, you buy weapons with the proceeds. But they also become a big target. A target that other people are going to want to take, at least the rich areas. And again, if they take the rich areas away, you become a poor nation of farmers again. And again, if anybody with a gun looks in your direction, you're going to lose. So these two Dutch nations have a big problem on their hands. The British began immediately making actions and taking actions to annex the areas that contained the wealth. And of course, these Dutch republics are very, very unfavorable towards that. But remember, I told you earlier that while they are effectively independent nations, both the Transvaal and the Free Orange State aren't actually independent nations. And so the British actually do have some treaty wiggle room to effectively take control of the diamond and gold fields. And obviously the Boers are not happy with this, but they really don't have any recourse on what to do. And the British mismanage the situation, and they mismanage it badly. The Boers decide, at least for the moment, to take a wait-and-see approach. The British have claimed the area, but they haven't really started to get in to extract the resources, and the Boers that live on these pieces of property are able to do some of the extraction. In fact, they're starting to sell to various parties, and so for the moment, despite the British have done something in name, they haven't done it in fact, and so the Boers take this wait-and-see attitude. The other problem that the Boers had is that the Zulu, of course you're familiar with Shaka Zulu, and his descendants had been making very threatening actions on the edges of both British and Boer territory for the last 30 years or so, and the successor to Shaka was building up large armies that had the Boers concerned. These armies, while certainly no match for a modern European infantryman, could certainly do some damage. Shaka was an innovative tactical genius. We've talked about his bullhead, bull horns, and bull loin strategy before. We won't need to go over them again. And so the Boers are concerned about their own safety, and of course the person with the biggest army in southern Africa is the British. And so for the moment the Boers decide to stay quiet and see what the British are going to do. The British, to defend these new gold fields and diamond fields, decide to engage with the Zulus. And the British went in expecting that this was going to go like almost every colonial war in history, and the Europeans were going to walk in, use their guns to eviscerate the armies of the natives and easily take possession of the entire area. And the British could not have been more wrong. We've already talked about the Zulu victory. That victory actually occurred at a place called, and I have to look up my notes to pronounce this correctly, the battle was fought at a place called Isandlwana, Isandlwana, and more than 1,600 British troops are killed fighting the Zulus. Now, remember, more Zulus died than British. In fact, something like 6,000 Zulu warriors died in this attack. But the fact that a British army column had been wiped out by natives was unbelievable. Now, again, the British then won a battle literally the next week where they hid behind a stone wall and in a barn, and less than 1,000 British troops killed 6,000 Zulu troops, and the Zulu lost that battle. So the British were still far superior from a technological point of view, but British overconfidence had led to a devastating defeat. Now, this matters in this lecture because the Boers took note that the British troops, under pressure, did not apparently perform very well, and that British troops on the defensive enjoyed incredible success against a military force that was clearly capable of defeating them. And the Boers wrote that down, proverbially. They said, the defensive is valuable. If we use the defensive for ourselves and make them come to us, we will have an advantage. And of course they would. So the Zulu were officially defeated in 1879. The Boers, in the regions with the diamonds and the gold, are put under increasing pressure by the new British Lord of the Army, who is trying to force these people to do what he wants them to do. And in 1880, the Boers in the regions of the Transvaal, controlled by the British, rebel. And they throw off their British leaders and they throw off the British troops in the areas, and they basically take to the woods and they set up defensive lines and defensive fortifications and dare the British to come in and take back the territory. Now the British of course tried to do just that, but again the Boers had written things down, the Boers had studied what happened to the British in the Zulu War, and they used the tactics that had worked for the British against them. They took up strong defensive fortifications and they just made the British come in and get them out. In fact, those old commando units, remember I told you to remember that word, commando, began to operate with incredible efficiency against the British. The British would conquer a town, and the Boers would seemingly accept, and then all of the men and boys would disappear that night, mount on their horses, and begin taking crack shots at the British as they moved on the next day. And so effectively what would happen is the British easily conquered territory, but then they couldn't hold on to it. The Boer would get on their horses, grab their guns, and they would basically sting the British from all directions. There's very few pitched battles in the First Boer War. The Boers are just wearing the British down. And by the way, this is an incredibly effective technique. It has worked against many armies, including the Soviet Union and the United States in both Vietnam and even, you could argue, in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's easy to take territory. The problem is holding it. Okay, you can get in and get out, that's fine, but if you actually want to make real change in an area, you have to hold on to that territory, and that's really not possible. By 1881, the British are in a difficult political situation. Now, by no means had the Boer won the war by exhausting the British's ability to fight. They had more soldiers, more guns, more ammunition. They could have fought almost indefinitely, and if they'd send a large army against the Boers, the war would have been over very, very shortly. But the British simply did not have popular support at home. In fact, the government was thrown out of power in 1880 and was replaced by a liberal government in 1881. And the liberal government said, look, this war is not worth it. The international press is against us. The British public opinion is against us. And what is there really to gain from this gold and these diamonds? In reality, they are not worth our deaths. They are not worth our time. They are not worth the difficult situation we are in. And so they signed a peace agreement. In fact, this is the first peace agreement since 1783, which ended the American Revolution, in which Britain was the power that had lost, in a sense. Now, the treaty didn't say Britain's lost, but Britain actually had to give up more than it got in the peace treaty. And so in that sense, we can think of the British as the losers of the First Boer War. Now, the fact that there's a Second Boer War tells you that the peace does not last, and let's talk about why that is. There's two main reasons. Number one, the Boers know that the British probably will not leave them alone forever. Okay, they're smart in this. And so they decide to take those resources that they now have access to, that gold and that diamonds, and they begin to buy one of the most elite fighting armies that money can buy. They begin equipping themselves with weapons. They begin equipping themselves with dedicated military trainers. And by the way, there is a country that has a vested interest in seeing Britain take some losses. lose some pieces of Africa that might belong to them. And oh, by the way, they have colonies that are very, very close to the Cape Colony. And if you guess the French, you are actually wrong in this case. The French had been badly beaten by the Germans. They were not in a position to do this. They needed England to be strong. It was actually the Germans who had a vested interest in the British having problems in South Africa. And so the Boers find a very happy provider of weapons and ammunition in the German army. And so the Boers, over the next 20 years, from 1881 to 1899, begin buying huge quantities of German weaponry, including machine guns, artillery pieces, barbed wire, and a number of other things that are going to be put into use if there is another conflict with the British. Meanwhile, the British begin selecting much more capable commanders and governors of the Cape Colony. And one of these commanders is a man by the name of Cecil Rhodes, who expects to do nothing less than conquer all of the usable parts of South Africa. By the way, he is incredibly successful at this, so much so, and this is something that you're probably not aware of because these nations were gone long before you were alive, that two nations in Africa later would bear Cecil Rhodes' names, and those were the countries of South and North Rhodesia, which are today Zimbabwe and Zambia. Okay, so Cecil Rhodes is put into power in the Cape Colony in 1896, and he has direct designs on these Boer republics, and he is going to manufacture a reason to go to war with them. As things begin to escalate between the two nations, there are several attempts at peace between the Boer and the British, but Cecil Rhodes is determined to have those resource-rich areas, and based on a rumor of some border conflict between the Boer and the English settlers, some sporadic fighting, Rhodes orders the local British regiments and army into Boer territory. And much to everyone's surprise, both internally and internationally, the Boer armies actually successfully defeat these British columns, and they actually return the favor of invading the British Cape Colony and placing under siege 3 British cities. And these sieges will last the better part of a year. Rhodes had bitten off more than he had expected, and certainly more than he can chew. This time, however, the British are not in the mood to sign a humiliating peace deal, and it appears that the Boers this time are also not willing to simply accept the status quo, and they actually want territory if the war is going to be fought this time. This is going to force the British to throw a huge number of troops into this war. In fact, the British would later ship 400,000 fighting and 200,000 support personnel into South Africa. This is larger than the entire population of the Boer republics combined. So there's more British soldiers in southern Africa than there are the entire population of the people they're fighting against. By the way, two very important people that you're already familiar with that are going to interact not with each other but with the Boers in South Africa are Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of the Indian independence movement, and Winston Churchill, who actually served as a military attaché. He was actually a newspaper reporter who also held rank in the British Army, and he is going to have what I think of as one of the most exciting intervals in his entire life. He is actually riding on an armored train car which gets attacked by Boer commandos. He is captured by Boer commandos after shooting several of them off the train with his handgun. He's thrown into a prisoner camp. He breaks out, and then he treks more than 300 miles across a desert before wandering into a Boer town where only one person in the entire town is an Englishman, and Winston Churchill happens to knock on that guy's door. He hides Winston Churchill, gives him clothes, and Winston Churchill smuggles himself out of town and eventually rejoins the British and joins the British in their final push on the Boer capital of Pretoria. This is quite the amazing story, and one of the many reasons why I think if you've never thought about studying or reading some Winston Churchill, you absolutely should. His life is, to say the least, exciting. Now, let's get back to the war itself. The British Lord Kitchener, one of the most famous men in the British military in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he's also on that famous picture of World War I, if you're familiar with it, with the British general pointing at you with the big mustache. That's Lord Kitchener. Inspired a Uncle Sam poster where he points at you, looking at the poster, and he says, "I need you," or "I want you," in the blah, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, whatever he says. There's a British version of that poster you've seen, even though you probably can't picture it immediately, but it's Lord Kitchener pointing at you. Lord Kitchener is called in from India, where he had been serving, and with a 400,000-man army, he is able to break the sieges on these British towns, and he's able to invade the Boer republics and take Pretoria after approximately 1 year of fighting. Now, you might think that the war is then over, but it is not by any means. Again, just like the First Boer War, taking the territory was not all that difficult. In fact, if I could put this out there, the Boers really wasted their money in a lot of ways with much of the equipment they had bought from the Germans. The artillery pieces and the machine guns, while they are certainly effective, the amount of troops that the British could use really made those items useless, unless the Boer could somehow manufacture more troops, and they couldn't. But what the Boer were incredibly good at was fighting a commando guerrilla war after their capital was taken. In fact, for the next 2 years, the Boer would fight an intense backcountry war with the British. The British would move into each town and they would look for soldiers and they couldn't find any, and as they left town, British Boer commandos would come out of the fields, they would come out of the woods, and they would fire on the British, and there was this incredible back and forth fighting for 2 years. That was incredibly brutal. In fact, Freudian slip there, the British actually were so frustrated that they began to throw Boers into concentration camps to basically keep an eye on them. And many historians believe that more people died of disease during this period of the war than actually died of the fighting. And unfortunately, as you might be able to guess from concentration camps, women and children were caught up in this as well. Because, of course, the women of the Boers were feeding their men. They were supplying their men. And so this is why guerrilla wars often become such brutal conflicts, because you can't just deal with the men like you can in a standing army. If you really want to defeat and pacify an area, you have to take the women and the children too, to stop them from getting weapons and ammunition to their fathers and their husbands, to stop them from feeding their fathers and husbands and hiding them. And you really have to take a all or nothing approach. And of course, that brings a lot of moral problems. In fact, I think the best way to avoid that situation is not get into a situation where you're doing it in the first place. And if you do find yourself in that situation, you're in a difficult moral predicament. All of that being said, after several years of fighting, the Boer leaders decide to lay up their weapons, and they sign another peace treaty with the British. This time the Transvaal and the Free Orange State are absorbed into the South African colony, eventually becoming the Cape Colony in 1910, and the Boer citizens are effectively given all of their property. And in many ways, this is a relatively lenient result to the war. The British certainly could have been far worse in their handling of the peace than they were. And by the way, I think this is why there's not a third Boer War. And eventually, because of different things that were going on in the British Empire, the English and Dutch settlers of South Africa eventually really came together and worked together to, unfortunately, put other groups of people that lived in South Africa in very difficult situations, and that is, of course, apartheid. And that is what you will be studying in lieu of our final lecture this week. Hopefully this has given you a good background as you begin to dive into the very complicated and very disturbing practices of South African apartheid. By the way, the word apartheid is thrown around sometimes in America. You know, that's an apartheid-like program. And for the record, I don't think, fortunately, in the modern United States, we've had anything like apartheid. Although you could argue that in the 1950s and 60s, we did have similar programs. And so I think this will be a good moment to look at another country's handling of these racial issues and ask the question, is the United States handling it well? I would like to say that we are handling it better. That is my personal opinion. But are we handling it as well as we could have? And why did we avoid handling it like they did? Those are the questions that you're going to need to answer as you research this week.